Netmon Freemium delivers real-time network visibility to quickly identify emerging threats in your IT environment. Netmon Freemium is a free commercial-grade network forensics and traffic analytics solution. You can use Netmon Freemium's powerful capabilities to search against all observed network traffic, identify abnormal traffic patterns in application usage, and quickly analyze full packet captures. Take the first step towards real-time network visibility. Visit logarithm.com/freemium to learn more and download it today. NetSparker, the developers of desktop and cloud-based web application security scanners that enable you to automatically identify vulnerabilities in your web applications and web services. NetSparker scanners employ a unique and dead-accurate vulnerability scanning engine that automatically verifies vulnerabilities with their proof of concept. For more information, visit them on the web at netsparker.com or email at contact@netsparker.com. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul Security Weekly, where it's always better with lubricant. It's really cold here and really dry, so skin gets really dry in the winter. I got a quick announcement. InfoSec World, speaking of winter, we like going to warm places like Florida. On March 19th through the 21st of 2018, we will be at InfoSec World in Lake Buena Vista, Florida. Security Weekly subscribers can save 15% off the InfoSec World 2018 main conference or World Pass with the code OS18-SW. You can catch talks from, let me make sure I get this right, Adrian Sanabria, Diana Kelly and Ed Moyle, Jennifer Manella, Joseph Zacharias, Mark Arnold, and Matthias Medu, and Summer Fowler. Yes. All those people and more attend InfoSec World. I want to turn it over to our illustrious panel. Will you be attending InfoSec World this year? I highly recommend it. I haven't seen many of you on the lines via Skype that are attending InfoSec World. This could be your year. And I want to add, it's an excuse to head down to Florida.
Yes. I'll be actually speaking there, believe it or not.
Keith Levitt is speaking. So. I may or may not have known people that were on the advisory board approving talks, and had to disclose that it was highly biased, but we approved your talk. Well, I approved your talk and disclosed that Keith is my friend, and so I vote for Keith with like this kind of caveat, like Keith is my friend, and I love Keith. So there was a few people, Dave Kennedy as well, where I'm like, yes, I approve this person to speak at InfoSec World, but I have to disclose that there's a relationship there that we have with this person. So, Keith, looking forward to see you down there.
Dude, I'm excited to be down there in the wintertime. It'll be nice and warm.
Yeah.
I look forward to that more than anything.
And Paul, in a couple weeks, let's talk about that, because I think the Sands Orlando is the week after.
Okay.
So I may be able to make something happen depending on what the schedule looks like. So we should probably talk about that fairly soon.
You know what, listeners, just hang tight for a moment. I would love help with that conference. So any Security Weekly hosts that want to come down to sunny Florida, I think we can make that happen. So, John, I know you live in South Dakota. Jack, I know you're Florida, like you're old, so Florida's probably a great destination for you.
No, I try to stay in America.
Yeah.
Oh.
Joff, I know North Carolina is normally pretty warm, but if you want to head down to Florida,
No, my schedule for March is I'm teaching SANS Singapore for Sec 573, the automating information security with Python. So I'll be teaching in Singapore that week, Paul.
Okay.
Although I'd love to be there, I'm going to be in Asia.
Joff's
I don't
out.
know where the hell I'm going to be.
Joff is out. Jack doesn't want to leave the country. Larry's interested. John, come on now.
I might be able to come down. Like Larry said, it's the week before Sands Orlando, and also I think B-sides Orlando is around that same time as well. So
Yes.
Who knows? We might be able to make it.
Awesome. Hey, so I heard.
Oh, hey.
Yes,
Paul.
Larry.
Before we get started on the stories, I want to do something, because this is a unique opportunity. I wanted to give a shout out to my good friend Ed Scotus, who I got to hang out with last week. I got to go down to Ed's house in New Jersey, spend the entire day with him. and we did some IoT home automation stuff.
Yeah, how'd that go?
And it was awesome, and we got tons of stuff working. But I wanted to show you sort of what the fruits of my labor ended up with. So let me move this camera just a little bit here so you can see over my shoulder. And let's make it so you can see it.
That's the Blair Larry bitch project right there.
Yep. So hopefully you can hear the background noise from the microphone. But if we do this, Alexa, turn on the fish.
Okay.
Alexa, turn off the fish.
Okay.
And
You activated everyone's Amazon device, Larry.
Nice. So let's put the camera back.
I'm glad it was productive, Larry.
Yeah. So we connected something that was previously not connected to the internet, and Alexa controlled to the internet and enabled it for Alexa.
Did that involve any soldering?
Actually, it did, but it was 2 wires.
Not bad. Not bad.
Makes me wonder what kind of protocol it was.
Yeah. So effectively, what that device is, the McDonald's Frankie Filet-O-Fish guy, it's got a button that you turn on, and all I did was took it apart and extended the wires from the button so that I could connect it to GPIO pin and ground on a Raspberry Pi. And effectively, what it does is Raspberry Pi uses a Python GPIO module to send a pulse to turn the GPIO pin high. But you need to be able to access that from Alexa. And what happens is that we installed a package called FOMO, as in FAUX, false. And it's a Wemo network protocol clone. So Wemo controlled switches. And Alexa, never mind. Sorry, I have to tell Alexa to stop. Never mind.
Alexa, stop! Dear God, Alexa, no, keep going.
Alexa,
why doesn't that work with my kids?
Alexa, order a 55-gallon drum of lubricant.
Lube.
Which one would you like to add? That's the problem is there's multiple. And I just hit mute on my Alexa, so it won't do that anymore.
There you go.
So basically what happens is you tell Alexa through the Wemo, the skill, to search for your Wemo devices. You set FOMO to do something that, hey, here's a Wemo device on my network. And effectively what it does is when triggered to send that Wemo command, it's doing either an HTTP GET or POST request, or it will run a shell script.
Awesome.
And in this case, it will run a shell script, which is an SSH session, a keyless, key-based SSH session to the Pi, and executes a script on the Pi when it logs in. And that is the Python GPO toggle.
Sweet.
Nice.
Very nice.
Yes.
Alrighty.
And
So
for the record, we also generate entropy. Alexa, turn on the blue lava lamp. Oh, I hit mute. Never mind. Enough of that. Stories.
Demo fail. Demo
Hey,
fail.
can we? Does anyone want to shed some light on this Intel CPU vulnerability?
Oh,
Which
God.
one?
John, would
All
you
of
care to
them?
describe it for us?
I was going to let Keith do it. He's the expert on these things.
So not an expert on Intel CPU architecture, but the 2 different attacks are the Spectre attack, which is the speculation logic vulnerability. So that's an optimization flaw, more or less. CPU architecture says, based on some sort of predictive magic that it does, I believe that the next code that it's going to execute is the following. So it starts to pre-run that code accordingly, reaching out to address space and memory that is going to otherwise use that code and so forth. But in this case, if that's not actually what's supposed to be running, it will kind of walk that all back after executing it, which is ultimately where the flaw lies. Then there's also Meltdown, which is, I believe, of the 2 of them, the one that is speculated to be across architectures, because it deals with what was the right wording here? Out of order execution. So it's more of an optimization in a different way kind of flow.
So the one thing I noticed, Keith, was that Spectre is a vulnerability that you can execute and take advantage of within the same process versus Meltdown. Hopefully I've got this right, but Meltdown allows you to fetch bytes out of the kernel space regardless of the process that you're in. So Meltdown is potentially much more egregious. But however, Spectre, from my reading and understanding, was much more usable immediately in the short term. Would you agree with that?
That's my general understanding from everything I've read on it. And obviously, both of these are the biggest concerns to shared host environments, namely cloud architecture, because of the fact that suddenly you're reading memory on a system that you're not supposed to be able to read in some fashion. And of course, if you take 10 minutes on Amazon using, in this case, Spectre, you might be able to get memory space on the host and then, of course, move into other virtual environments.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the thing that a lot of people are leaping to. But the whole idea of like memory segmentation basically being bypassed by optimization routines is kind of at its core what's going on. So like, your CPU is trying to, a repetitive function. Let's say your CPU is doing the same thing over and over and over again. And after a while, it gets smart and it says, it's asking me to do the same thing 100 times. I'm just going to start pre-caching and start doing this thing, kind of queue it up. So I don't have to start at the beginning all over again. So it's going to start pre-queuing it. And that basically is allowing you to bypass the memory restrictions that are in place on your computer, and that's ultimately the big deal. And that can go, like you said, with virtualization. That can also basically bypass address space layout randomization, which is initially we thought is what the problem was, and it turns out that it was a much worse couple of bugs than just bypassing ASLR. So. Now, the question is, the patching on this, I would love to get everyone's opinions on this because the patching has been a goddamn nightmare. Intel basically told all of their customers, if you go to Intel's website to get a patch for it, they're like, nope, not us. Go to your motherboard manufacturer. They're the ones that are going to give you the patch because of the complexity of their chipsets. I think, Keith, correct me if I'm wrong, it's how you actually optimize the chipset on a motherboard and couple it with like a memory management unit or some kind of insanity. They've made the code available to motherboard manufacturers, but basically it's on the motherboard manufacturers to actually implement the fix and push the fix out to their customers. And then you have operating systems like Microsoft and Mac patched. I think Ubuntu was a little bit late to the game in getting their patches rolled out. So there's operating systems trying to patch this as well. And then you have people that are saying it's going to impact your CPU performance by 30% to 50%.
30 to 50? Is that true?
Yeah.
So that's not
kind of
entirely true,
bullshit,
depending on the architecture of the system itself. So like PCID, if you have PCID on your Mac operating system or your Mac MacBook, Mac OS device of some kind, then you're not going to see the same sort of performance hits because it's actually two different pins that are on the Intel chip itself that are using the speculative engine for Spectre, which is ultimately where that optimization hit can take place. So, I mean, it really depends on the actual device that you're using, going back to the motherboard architecture and so forth.
But it's also the software that's being run. Because some software will actually use that form of optimization and pipelining a lot more heavily than other software. So that's kind of, I think the worst case scenario is basically running a program that uses the pipelining optimization and it basically using it very, very heavily, and that's all it's doing. You can see a 50% performance hit. But on day-to-day operations, I think you'd be lucky if you even noticed it on your standard desktop or workstations.
So did any of us actually state that Spectre exploits speculative pre-calculation of execution paths? Well, I guess I've stated it now. The whole idea with CPU instruction optimization here is that the CPU has the ability to get ahead of the program that's running and say, well, I think there are X number of potential outcomes, and it can pre-compute speculatively, if you like, all of those outcomes, and then it can either decide to dump the result or execute one of those, or essentially execute the pre-computation, depending on where the code lands. And so that's the heart of the issue with Spectre, as I understand it.
Yeah, and that dumping part, that's where the issue is. Whenever it actually dumps it, it's actually cached, and you can basically still access it. And that's part of the problem.
And
right. And so where you
is
lose performance operationally is the fact that that sort of forward caching, that forward speculation is basically disabled in patching, and so you just don't get that kind of performance gain that you formerly would get in at least kernel space, if I understand it. Maybe Keith could comment on that.
Well, and also just to be totally transparent, Spectre is, of the two of them, the one that is specific to Intel architecture. So then you also have Meltdown, which again is the one that's hypothetically across all different architectures, ARM, so all the different architectures that you're going to see, ARM64, etc. Go ahead, John.
Oh, I was just going to say, we were talking about it before the show. Now, Meltdown, I think, is the one that Intel is saying that AMD is also vulnerable to. Is that correct?
That's my understanding of it, and I don't think that they cited it specifically that it was Meltdown in their kind of announcement, but they were saying that this flaw affects more than just Intel architecture, and in the sense that from everything I'm reading and everything I'm looking at for the Meltdown attack, that is potentially across different architectures, so including Intel, of course, AMD, ARM, and so forth. And again, that's more of an optimization that's not related to the speculative processing that's taking place with Spectre, whereby they're saying, okay, I'm going to do out-of-order processing based on ease of computation. So if this is going to be a faster computational time, I'm going to optimize for performance here accordingly and do this task before this other one as a result of the fact that I can use more of my computing power or my compute time accordingly.
Yep. And just so everybody knows, I think a lot of us in this industry are still trying to get our heads around this and what the overall implications are. And this is a bad one. I put out last night that 2018 basically showed up after 2017 and said, "Here, hold my beer and watch this." So we're going to be seeing this vulnerability, I think, for a long time, because I don't think that we're going to see the patches out, especially when we start talking about Internet of Things. This is not something that's going to be readily patched anytime real soon. And also, Keith, like I keep deferring to you on this because you're the expert in this area. This isn't just like one vulnerability. This is actually, I think Spectre is a brand new class of vulnerabilities. This is something that's going to continue to be a problem going on down the line. How is that playing into it?
So that's a really good point, because again, this is actually something that both Chrome, the Chrome team, and Mozilla, so Firefox, have said is potentially or is actually vulnerable through the browser, right? So we're seeing all sorts of JavaScript calls to systems that are now being potentially compromised or have the potential to be compromised via the browser. So this is definitely one of those things that is going to be, it's going to have a long tail, especially with how many of those systems out there, IoT devices that are remotely manageable, web-facing properties of some kind or web-facing interfaces. And so, yeah, in terms of vulnerabilities, this is in the same class of, or not as class, but the same world of vulnerabilities as Rowhammer, right? Like, you're not going to do away with that until you replace the hardware or the architecture itself.
Yep.
Do you think, I just got a question on that. Do you think in the interim, the browser vendors in particular, given the specter of Spectre, I had to make that joke. Do you think they're going to move away from a threaded model towards more of a multi-process model to try to mitigate the immediate concerns, or do you think they're going to lose too much performance out of that? I mean, this is a really interesting computational challenge from my perspective. There's the classic sort of computational performance challenge versus a security benefit issue.
So Chrome has actually already given out guidance for something that they were working on before this vulnerability was released, which is the per process lockdown of sites itself. In fact, here, let me just pull up real quick the actual link that I have, because there's actual Chrome flags that you can enable right now. And I'll put this in the show notes that allows you to do, let's see what the actual word is here. strict site isolation. So it's an experimental security model that allows you to actually ensure each render process contains pages from at most one site. So this is one thing that, as of right now, they've said, look, in Chrome 64, we're going to actually have a patch to protect you against these attacks. For now, go ahead and enable strict site isolation, because that's going to at least keep you in the same memory space, as far as I understand, for each page process itself. So distributed threading or versus multi-processor or multi-core, it'll be interesting to see what they do. Honestly, I mean, I think we've all probably had our experiences with Chrome where it takes up huge amounts of memory, huge amounts of compute time, depending on what you're trying to do with it. Versus, I think now with Firefox, they've got Quantum, I think is the new one, that they're doing all sorts of interesting things in that realm as well. And I have not looked at Firefox's remediation or even stopgap for this as of yet. But
I was going to say Firefox is very agile right now because of the rewrite of the code base. And it seems like competitively, they might well try to take advantage of this situation, and they should.
The problem with that is a user problem, in that I have a Google account, and when I install Chrome, my experience in Chrome is tied to my Google account, and so I think even if you got to take some performance hits, that usability feature kind of trumps all, which is kind of interesting, as we have another story that came to light this week about storing passwords inside of your browser versus what I think, and I'll extend the stories that were published. Basically, the stories are saying if you store passwords inside your browser, there's some flaws or weaknesses that allow attackers to pull those out. I think largely as security professionals, we've been like, well, you really shouldn't store passwords inside of your browser or use your browser's password store because, well, just reasons, right? And I think password managers like 1Password or LastPass do a much better job of securing your passwords because, well, reasons, right? Like, I don't know, most of us probably use some kind of password manager. I'd imagine that those of us on the panel today and those of us listening are like, I don't use what's included with my browser because, well, reasons. And I really believe those reasons boil down to the browser developers that are developing Chrome and Firefox and, God forbid, Microsoft Internet Explorer are just not focused on protecting the integrity and confidentiality of your credentials. Whereas you go to a third party such as 1Password or LastPass, their sole mission in life as a company and as a developer is to protect your credentials. And while there have been vulnerabilities in all of these systems, I think largely we put our confidence in those companies that have made it their mission to protect our credentials. There are other technical issues that Larry, I know, has talked about on the show before about some of the insecurities in storing passwords in your browser. Jack, I know this is an issue that you and I have talked about as well. If you want to be, kind of the first to comment from the panel.
I just wanted to throw KeyPass out there from news from a couple of weeks ago. Not all of them get it right, but it's good, and I think it's a good point. I'm trying to remember the details. I know there have been a couple of vulnerabilities in password stores years ago. Sure. But your point is valid. It's an add-on. It's a convenience feature, and afterthought sort of features don't get the testing they deserve. And also they're not doing what the major password vaults are doing. They're not providing that cross-platform, some of them do cross, but they're not providing the extra stuff like, hey,
what about two-factor? Jack, do they provide two-factor? Because I use LastPass. I use LastPass with two-factor to protect.
Right, that's
90% of my passwords.
But the better password managers also tell you interesting things about your passwords, about domains that have been popped, about accounts that you haven't changed in a while, about weak passwords. They do a lot more than just store.
The best one is, Jack, LastPass is great for this. Hey, you're using the same password across X numbers of sites. Like, you said in the past, which I love, like I'm on conference calls all day long today, and you know what? While I'm on conference calls and I'm listening, going through LastPass and I'm cleaning up all those sites that have password reuse. That's just general good hygiene that LastPass enables you to fix.
Right. Those sort of tools are doing a lot more than just in browser stuff. And, for all the effort that goes into browsers, they're still imperfect unless you're trying to test RAM. I mean, let's face it.
Another interesting story that I find I think is going to provide some comic relief to this segment. It's from Zdnet, 10 things in cybersecurity that you might have missed in 2017. Now, we talked a lot about security in 2017, all of us on the panel today. We talked about, and what's interesting, number one in their list, apps can use ultrasonic sounds to track where its users go. We talked about that as a story.
Yep. Yes, and the sad part is, at work we actually talked about this 2 days ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now, number two, Facebook can match you with your relatives that you didn't know you had. I don't know if that's necessarily a security-related story. Kind of interesting.
That's interesting.
Privacy, like a privacy-related story, potentially?
Yeah, I mean, potentially. What I find is kind of a segue off of that story, I don't know if you folks have experienced this as well. I've talked about my headphone fetish, right? And Facebook, actually, I found after some investigation, does a pretty good job allowing you to control some of your privacy settings and says, hey, do you want to allow like other sites that have like our Facebook code embedded on their site to associate your interest with your Facebook ads? And they actually, Facebook allows you to control that. And so because I've taken interest in and bought several different pairs of headphones in 2017, I see ads from Master and Dynamic, from Audize, and I'm like, that's great. I'm like, but I've like either bought those headphones or made the decision not to buy those headphones. I think they're interesting, but and so they don't give you the control to say, yes, I want to see these advertisements, but I've either already bought that product or I'm not interested in that product. The only thing you can do in Facebook is say, either, yes, this ad is relevant to me, or hide this ad and hide other ads like it. And I'm like, no, I still want to see ads like that from other manufacturers. I just don't want to see this ad because with respects to Audize, like I've already bought a pair of their cans. Like they're a great, innovative company. They make great headphones. I bought one for the studio, one for myself. Like they're fantastic headphones. I don't necessarily want to see this particular ad as well, which I think is from a privacy perspective, giving the user control of what you see and also what you share is very important.
It's not just Facebook. Facebook does have a lot of granular controls, but there are a lot of interesting places. I spend my browsing when I'm not behind a ad blocking firewall with people trying to sell me Nessus because of my browsing habits. And it turns out that's really not a good sales pitch.
Yeah. True.
And that's just one example of the granularity, and it's amazing how back to the other story about connecting you with the dots that they're able to connect are kind of terrifying. But it's amazing what they link, and as granular as it is, it's never granular enough. Like you said,
and that's exactly my point, Jack. You summed it up in one sentence, right?
It's like when you go into Amazon and they have those buy it again things, and yeah, there are some expendables that you want to buy again, but there are some huge purchases that I'm not going to make every 3 months. And you can stop suggesting I buy a couple $1,000s worth of audio gear every 3 months. I'm not going to order a new set of speakers quarterly.
The funny part is, so I bought a bidet. I told the story, I think, on the show in 2017, right? Like I bought a bidet on Facebook, and I ended up on the, hey, Paul really likes to have a clean butt kind of list. And I started getting advertisements for all of these like really like you want a really clean butt kind of advertisement.
Huh.
Wait. Step back. You bought a bidet from Facebook?
No, from Amazon. I bought a tushy.
Wait. Step back. You bought a bidet
From Amazon. Yeah, it's called Tushy. It's a toilet seat that connects to your water supply in your toilet, and it turns your regular toilet into a bidet. I mean, who doesn't want that, right? Like, I mean, that's pretty cool.
Wait. Now, is this intended to wash your butt, or is it a drinking fountain for the dogs?
Why not both?
Both. It's a dual purpose device, Larry, right? But
Just
so
checking,
that ended
just checking.
that put me on the
You're on a list.
You're on a list of like
You're on
I
a
like
list,
clean butts,
yes.
which means that when an advertisement from another company like Wish.com, which is a weird app, I don't know if I'd order anything from because it's really shady. They start like, hey, connect this device to your garden hose, and then it goes inside of your butt for a clean butt. And I'm like, yeah, no, that's that's a far cry from like I want a bidet.
Colonic.
Like a bidet is a really cool thing. Like all these other devices start to get into like a rabbit hole. So in that,
this is a
It's not a rabbit hole. It's a butthole.
it's a butthole.
So this
that
is
was a
a-
butthole.
So this is a
And-
strange
and-
segue, but I need to leave and go pick up my children, and I'm terrified at how that segue will actually play out.
It's
Um,
Or
so-
play
good
play
excuse,
in
John.
And out,
We
and in and
now
out,
remember
please.
why John
Did-
doesn't
so
come on the
I
show
just,
very often.
Paul, next time I'm there, I just want to sit and watch your computer and see the ads of hoses that get shoved up your ass for cleaning products, and I'm really excited to see how that fresh feeling works out at the end.
John, it's simple. Just order a tissue off of Amazon, and you get to see them yourself.
Yeah.
Tushy.
Tushy.
A related note for the Road
All right,
Warriors:
you guys
Sap Brothers
have
truck
a
stops have
great
installed
evening.
bidets in
I'll
all the
talk to
ladies'
you all
rooms, but
later.
not the men's rooms.
Bye, John.
My-
Bye,
Bye,
John.
John.
Have a good night.
I'm sorry, Jack. What was that?
Related note for the Road Warriors: Sap Brothers truck stops have installed bidets in all of the ladies' rooms, but not the men's rooms. There's a long story behind that. but
there-
anyway.
Or they're going to get confused.
Another story from Zdnet was that Apple hides job postings on secret servers. In other words, if you can find the job posting, then you qualify for the job. Jack, I know you and I work for a company that did something kind of similar, which I think is cool. Don't get me wrong. I don't think you should necessarily. I think it's a fine line. It's kind of a double-edged sword, if you will. I don't know if you want to make a game out of how you apply for a job or discover talent on your website. I don't know that also necessarily qualifies for the
Something
10
in
things.
cybersecurity we might have missed?
Yeah, thank you, Larry.
I was going to say for that one though, what are the security implications that it's kind of giving rise to? And again, I am not a lawyer, but with that being said, if you've got this secret like hiring job page, is that implicit authorization of people performing unauthorized pen tests against said web server, web page, or
Good point,
what have
Keith.
you? Like,
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, somebody has to ask about scope, right? So if that's in scope, is hacking the HR system and making yourself an employee without applying in scope? You know.
Question for your lawyer. I would say on Twitter, we also talked about, I don't know if you folks saw the tweet, like basically if scammers call you, can we distribute that phone number and have everyone call them back? Well, I thank you to the person that brought that up, but like, you know, all these the kind of legal questions, like you got to consult with your lawyer on that. What I've learned over time, and you folks have dealt with this too, like things that relate to your legal liability or your liability as a person or your liability as a company fall within your legal team that's advising you. And I say team because if it's a question of intellectual property, that could be one person. If it's a question of business law, that could be a separate person. If it's a question of disclosure and criminal kind of things, that could be a different person, much like we have in information security today. If it's a question of forensics, we might consult one expert. If it's a question of pen testing, we might consult a different person, and so on and so forth. Also, if it's a question of tax ramifications, that's a question for an accountant versus a lawyer. So I think that all of these questions have to be directed towards people that you trust that have that level of expertise. And so we're talking about these issues where it's an HR thing to allow people to be curious and discover things on your site. The legalities largely fall on whatever experts you choose to call upon, whether you're on the I'm looking for a job side or whether you're on the company and I'm looking for people to hire. And I think that's pretty sound advice across the board, like to talk about how you proceed moving forward.
Don't pretend to be a lawyer yourself because you're only going to get hurt.
Consult experts, right? You know?
Yeah.
The other thing on this list, deleting your Yahoo email account can be surprisingly difficult. This is one that I think for many of us on the panel kind of hits close to home, like removing an account or deleting an identity or anything that gets posted to the internet is difficult, and maybe not so much difficult for people like us that are on the panel or people listening, but for people in the general population that are like, I had a Yahoo account as in this example, and I heard from my security friends that it's not a good thing and I want to delete it, so I need to go do that, but it's really difficult. And I think that's in poor taste of a lot of these providers.
It is, and then there are more angles to this too, depending on who you are and how public you are. So, Paul, you decide you're fed up with Yahoo because, well, there's so many reasons to be fed up with Yahoo over the decades. And you dump your account that you used, haven't used in 10 years. But now, Paul.Asadorian. Whatever is available, and some clever person grabs that account once it becomes available and does bad things. It's more of an issue with like a Twitter or Facebook or whatever,
Jack,
in social media, but it's a real challenge. I want to
segue this, and I want to put this question out to our panel and our audience today, in that I have a home phone number that I've had for probably 16 or so years, right? And I think we've progressed today where we enter into a contract with our cable provider, and that covers internet, it covers cable, it covers telephone. And I'm like, I can progress very easily. And Larry, you and I have talked about doing a segment of how you progress to basically just having an internet arrangement with your provider. I don't need cable. I don't need a home phone. But
just need data.
Personal protection, I'm like, to your point, Jack, if I give up my home phone number, what if someone else gets that? I'm not comfortable giving that up. How do I maintain my personal security and privacy and also give up my whatever, $10 a month or whatever it is, $14 a month to my cable provider?
More importantly, Paul, that home phone number is the one that I give to everyone that I don't care who calls me. That's like my spam catcher email address.
Yeah, or it's the one that could be tied to services and or agreements between car insurance. It could be agreements with any type of organization that you're like, I don't know. Like I said, I've had this thing for over 15 years. Who knows what that's tied to, and who knows what harm I could suffer if someone else were to impersonate that phone number to be able to get. So I'm like, well, do I just, for insurance purposes, continue to pay that $10 or $15 a month just to keep that phone number, and how do I offload that? I think it's a valid issue in today's world, kind of moving forward as we talk about cutting the cord.
Absolutely, and there are issues that go to the economics for the provider, whether it's an email address or a Twitter handle or a phone number, how long do they let that sit? I was some years ago assigned a phone by an employer, and as soon as I got the phone and turned it on, I started getting text messages with bank balances for every account that the previous person who had that had. Now, I couldn't access the money, but I knew how much money they had in checking and in savings and how much they owed on their mortgage.
Yeah,
and when anything posted. And recently somebody fat-fingered a phone number, and I started getting on a phone number I've had for 18 years. I started getting notified from a healthcare organization, reminders for appointments and reminders for tests and things like that. It's like, there's so many implications of these things that we take casually or took casually a long time ago. And now that it's all electronic, now that it's all internet, right? I mean, you're talking about your home phone number, but your home phone number it can be a POTS line, but it's not plain old telephone service anymore.
Well, and also, the concern is, we as Security Weekly covered a story of a journalist that was kind of under, I don't want to call it identity theft, but basically said, hey, look, someone impersonated me to the cellular provider, was able to, in that attack, switch my phone number to their SIM card. With that, they were able to gain access to the SMS two-factor authentication and start to take over my life. Because essentially, that's what it boils down to. Like, if you have access to someone's email and or SMS number, you can do a lot of damage to someone's life digitally, right? And I kind of took that to heart and said, we need to really, thought to myself, like, we really need to protect our access to these phone numbers. And I've personally dealt with a lot of people that are like, yeah, I changed phone numbers and I'm suffering the consequences to either, like, I've lost that phone number and there was this one service, like my domain, for example, that used that as two-factor authentication that was bad, that went bad, that said, I can't make any changes because you don't own that phone number. You don't own that email. As I go back to our story that we talked about in Zdnet with, like, I don't have access to that Yahoo account anymore because I deleted it. And by the way, I'm screwed now. So I think it's an issue today that when you authenticate to these various services, it's your email or your phone number that's doing that, and that's not necessarily a representation of correct kind of validation of your identity.
How hard would it be to use something like your password manager to look at all the different accounts that you have login credentials to and then say, okay, I need to go and work through all of these, not to change the password, but to make sure that my phone number is the right phone number. Like, at the end of the day, I think that those are ultimately the systems or the accounts that you really care about. So, I mean, for me, like, I recently moved to a new address, bought a house. And so for me, it was going through and changing my address for all of those different accounts to make sure that I got the bills and then could pay them accordingly. So in the same way, wouldn't it just be the same sort of thing for you where you're tracking, okay, what do I actually have an account on that I care about because I've got a unique password for it? Make sure my password for that is set appropriately, or in this case, phone number, and then move on. Because everything else is, to Larry's point, probably junk.
Yeah, I love that Keith is looking at this from a programmer's perspective. Like how can we programmatically look at this information and change it? Because I think Keith brings up a valid point. Like, your address, your phone number, and your email are very much personally identifiable information that needs to, when you change it, allow for a process that changes that and all the systems that you access. And, undergoing a name change here at Security Weekly, I've personally dealt with those issues, and there's always, like, the stragglers. And if we can programmatically identify, Keith, what you're talking about, like the stragglers, I think we put ourselves, not just, us listening or us on the show, but everyone else in a much better position. Yeah, that's interesting too. Mark brings up the Facebook log out of all kind of button. Like, if you've trusted a device, or you've trusted something with any of these social media networks, you can basically go in and say, distrust anything. And I've done that. I think that's a step in the right direction that could help solve this problem. Like, basically, some event has changed my trust level. Like, I've moved, I've changed my email, my phone number. Someone else had access to my account that was trusted but is no longer trusted, and therefore I want to distrust everything. And to trust that again, I want to be able to provide my username and my password and my two-factor authentication token. Personally, I use YubiKey as well as my username and password to do that. I wish more people would trust that physical token, because that gets around some of the issues of trusting it to a phone number or any other kind of personally identifiable information, which is why I like a solution, and I'll name it. I use YubiKey, which introduces, as Jack, I kind of see you grimacing, right? Like, that introduces some level of inconvenience, right? Because I'm in one location, I gotta go upstairs or somewhere else and get my YubiKey to physically authenticate. But the level of security that provides, I feel, is really awesome and worth that inconvenience. Jack, do you agree? Disagree?
No, I agree. You have to think about whether or not it makes sense. And in that case, it probably does. The YubiKey probably makes sense for you in that situation. But people make things needlessly complex at times, and then more often they make things overly simple without taking the actual risk into account, because they think, we've all heard the I'm not a target thing. It's like, well, all right, so we have to explain how targeting works, because no, mom or dad or son or daughter, if you're me, nobody's going to sit down and target you unless they've got a personal grudge, but there are scripts running that are going to target you because you happen to be connected to the internet, or because you're a user of whatever service or application. And so, stop and think about what's worthwhile. And I think that's, I think that's great. And you're running upstairs is certainly worth it if you're protecting something worth protecting. And that really varies, and you can't even see the same thing. So, Paul, or any of us on this podcast, how much effort should you put into protecting your Twitter account versus the average Twitter user? Well, we should all be doing the enhanced two-factor authentication stuff, because our social media has value.
A great point, Jack. Twitter recently supports Google Authenticator. Is that true?
Yeah, they're third party. They open up to whatever you use. It's not just their SMS or their built-in app connection. So they can use whatever it is you use, if it's a standard, whether it's Duo or whoever's authenticator, Google or whatever you use.
I wasn't able to
I wish that was more
connect my YubiKey, but I was able to use Google Authenticator, which I think is much better than SMS.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. SMS, we get into the radio problems on mobile devices and that, but you have to use what you're familiar with. What drives me nuts about two-factor auth is there's always that one app that only works with that one thing. And it's almost always based on Google's code base, and then they take it in a different direction, unless it's something very specific, like either the cool stuff that Duo does or legacy stuff like RSA. And so you end up, I can't be the only one on the call, or certainly not the only one, from our listeners that looks at their phone and has 4 or 5 different two-factor auth apps on their phone, because there's like one vendor that went in one direction, and then you have one for Microsoft because it just works better than using Google on Microsoft. And Google and RSA.
I agree, but largely today, I think that most of the services that I use today either support YubiKey or Google Authenticator, and I'm okay with that. I wish, I really wish I could use YubiKey rather for everything, right? Because it's a physical token, right? Like physically you have to possess my token or the code that it generates, right? Like I really like that level of authentication. Now, with Google Authenticator, like you can't just like there's a lot of barriers to entry to getting to my Google Authenticator. You can't just necessarily steal my phone. There's some hoops to jump through before you do that. With the YubiKey, it is separate from my phone. So if you steal my phone, like that's fine, whatever. None of my two-factor, if everything was YubiKey second factor authenticated, you steal my phone, whatever. You don't have my YubiKey, right? You have to steal my actual YubiKey, and it puts some separation between the YubiKey and the phone. And I think there's some merit to that, to be honest with you.
Going back full circle, it's just really too bad that there isn't something like what the U.S. Postal Service does, where you say, I've changed my address, and then for the next period of time, all things get forwarded to your new address or your phone number, where it's simply, I am dropping my phone number, and it simply does something with the registry where any important phone numbers that otherwise are using that for verification of some form get forwarded accordingly, maybe to a cell phone, for example.
True.
Yeah. So
right, but that's that has the luxury. USPS has the luxury of monopoly of that class of delivery. That doesn't work for the packages that come via UPS and FedEx. In this case, moving from a landline on, Verizon to a Comcast IP-based phone. They're two different companies. They're never going to play nice because there isn't a competitive advantage to being other than miserable bastard telcos.
I want to move to choosing a secure home wireless router. And I know that sounds kind of interesting and something that we've talked about a lot in the past. But
no such thing.
Well, in today's day and age, Motherboard has essentially released an article that talks about these various issues. And the first thing that they state is you got to choose a router. I have to tell you, if there's any one single question that we get that likely could be the most popular from all of our subscribers across all of our shows, it's how do I choose a wireless router that is secure, that is most reliable? I think in our audience, which I love, thank you, audience, that they identify security. Like, how do I choose the most secure? And then how do I choose the most reliable and usable kind of comes second, because if they're listening to us, they're very security minded. And I think that's awesome. I commend our audience for that. I think price is probably the third thing. And I want to say, in looking at the social media kind of comments that I respond to in this arena, that there's a lot of solutions today that are Google has a Wi-Fi system, Eero has a Wi-Fi system, and I'm like, that's great. I'm like, that's good. I've been accomplishing the same things that those solutions accomplish with my Ubiquity gear that I bought 10 years ago, right? This is nothing new. Great Wi-Fi gear, as Larry and I have researched since 2007, which is over 10 years ago now, Larry, has existed since then. I think that the one-off kind of Linksys and all that stuff that you're running as your firewall and your wireless at once largely has, I would like to see go the way of the dinosaur. I'd like to see your firewall be separate from something that provides your Wi-Fi, which is the first level for me. I think secondly, having Wi-Fi access points in your environment that don't necessarily need to be this new fancy bridging. Well, not that it's new, but some kind of bridging technology like Eero or Google Home that create this kind of Wi-Fi mesh or bridging in your environment. You don't necessarily need that if you can power over Ethernet those Ubiquity access points in your environment, like I've been doing for probably 10 years in my home, and even a shorter time here in the studio. Having that gear gives you the same level of speed and flexibility and integrity that you're getting from some of those Eero or Google Home devices. Have you guys seen that?
Well,
Can I throw a wrench into this?
Please do.
So firstly, it's how do you define secure? Secondly, how much time do you want to invest in actually managing or maintaining it? And then thirdly, how much are you willing to pay to reduce the level of complexity or to reduce the amount of time that you need to manage it, right? Like you can have two of those three. You can have secure, easy to manage, or costly. And usually the costly would get you secure and easy to manage, like Ubiquiti here. So I think that's really what comes to play here when it comes to networking gear is it could be difficult to manage. Maybe you put DDWRT on it, but the device itself works great. Like a Netgear device that I had previously, I think it was a Nighthawk.
Yep, me too.
Gave my whole house perfect Wi-Fi with just one device. But again, more management because I put DDWRT on it to make it more secure than default.
Well, and I find two keys along those lines. I got my Netgear Nighthawk several years ago. I put DDWRT on it, and every once in a while, like I gotta unplug it and plug it back in and reboot the thing, right? And I think there's three tiers. I think the first lower level tier that's accessible to most people are the Eero, the Google Homes, where it has the dual radio thing. I can plug it in, and it just works, right? I think the second tier is I run Ubiquiti, and I'm a little more hands-on and technical.
You got to specify which level of Ubiquiti though, because if you're talking edge router, that's actually something usable. If you're talking their gateway, I'm sorry, it's useless. I mean, it's reliable, it's simple, but it has no features.
No features. It's a great
point.
No
features.
Yeah.
And if you have to go to command line to do something like a DHCP reservation, which the average home user doesn't care about. But you and I and everybody listening to this, we've got stuff on our network that wants to be the same IP all the time. And if you're like me, you want it to be a DHCP reservation so that when you rebuild your network, you don't have to, log into that device. So there's a trade-off. The Ubiquiti gear is solid.
Yeah.
But let me throw out, there's a level below what you started with, which is just, and I wouldn't recommend this to anybody, but a lot of people do this. I would argue most do, which is just go to your,
Best Buy,
whoever your provider is, and let Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, whoever, put that all in one box in and trust them to do it right, which is a bad idea in my opinion.
Yeah.
But then you go up to what you're talking about, the Ubiquiti stuff. I've used for a really long time a freemium version of a commercial product. Those that have been listening for a long time can guess what it is, but they're not a sponsor. It's far from perfect, but it's a product line I've known for way over a decade, used to support. And it's imperfect, but it's easy to use, and but it needs to make sense for you. So I need a handful of things, and it lets me do it lets me do ad blocking at the gateway, which is really cool. But it also has some packet handling oddities because when you use Linux.
I agree, Jack. I think that, step 0, use whatever the internet service provider gives you. I think step 1 from that is you use a more unified solution. Step 2 from that, you might use Ubiquiti. Step 3, I think for the ultra nerds like ourselves, you might roll your own, right? You might build your own Linux device and use host APD. None of those solutions are necessarily wrong. It's just targeting the right user with the right solution.
And Paul, I'd caveat that just a little bit. Step 0, use what the provider provides to you, but change the default passwords, SSIDs, and pre-shared keys right out of the box. And maybe a step 1A is to use a consumer-grade access point with an open source firmware.
Yeah, I think, and Larry brings up a great point. Like step 1A is like you've separated your wireless from your firewall routing architecture, right? I think people search in that step 1 for one device that's going to do everything, and then you kind of separate that. So I think there's a lot of merit to talking about how we approach that home level security for those different audiences, and the new emerging kind of architecture that we've seen from Google and Eero and others is they're doing a great job on that Wi-Fi aspect and simplifying it for home users. However, there's a lot of intricacies in that process, and you can get great performance, integrity, and other things from that. But us as kind of nerds, there's a whole process that we need to go through. I really like Ubiquiti. I've used Ubiquiti in my home and here in the office. Great results. I've built my own firewalls on really inexpensive hardware and gotten great results. If you want to go the next step, Larry and I have both covered segments where we've built our own home firewalls that are probably over-spec'd, but offer great performance, and then separated out our wireless. So there's a lot of things to consider if you're approaching building your home wireless or even small business kind of internet and Wi-Fi. And don't pigeonhole yourself into the wrong area, I guess is the message.
And don't forget, I'm going to add a step negative one, if you like. If you're pen testing like I am every day, connect your damn system to the Ethernet and forget about wireless altogether.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
No, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I was going to say, you got to think about what you're using. Like, ultimately,
Yeah.
what's the purpose of Wi-Fi versus having wired in?
Yeah, it's convenience versus the mobility. That's not a trade-off. Sorry, convenience and mobility versus the actual reliability. And if you need reliability, don't use wireless at all.
Yeah,
right?
you know what's funny, Joff? Joff and many others on this that are still on this panel right now, Joff, Jack, Larry, and Keith, we've all been network administrators at some time. I think we can all agree that like a really poor Ethernet cable is still faster and more reliable than poor Wi-Fi, right?
Right. But how many of us have, so I have 2 Ultrabooks in my life. Neither has an Ethernet port on it. I have a handful of tablets and telephones. None of them have Ethernet ports on them. So yes, you can get adapters for them, but it becomes tedious to do Ethernet. But absolutely, there's a wire dangling off the laptop I'm talking to you guys with right now,
right,
in my office, and the machines that need to be reliable. My lab all has Cat 6 dangling out of from a switch to the lab pieces. The stuff that has to be there has to be there.
Exactly.
Jack, every
wireless
machine
awesome.
in my office right now. Every machine in my office right now has a wired connection, except for 2 Raspberry Pis, which are wireless. Everything else is wired.
Well, I want to thank you all for participating in this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. Turn over to Larry. Larry, please take us out.
Really? Wow. Oh. Over and out.
What he said. Over and out.